Hello and welcome. I'm Helen Atkinson, Senior Editor at Supply Chain Brain. I'm excited to be moderating this webinar today, sponsored by Oliver White, the topic for which is assumptions. Good questions lead to good assumptions. Assumptions are central to demand planning, but not all assumptions are created equal. Some are vague and non-specific, others are clear, owned, and easily acted upon. Asking the right questions can help you to separate the wheat from the chaff, improving the clarity of assumptions and thus the credibility of the demand plan. Today, you're going to find out about the vital role assumptions play in reaching consensus on a demand plan, how to improve the quality of assumptions with good questions, some questions to ask, and how to ask them. After I give you a brief introduction to Oliver White, we're going to have a presentation from two experts in demand planning from Oliver White. And then we're going to have a panel session and we're going to move into Q&A. Oliver White has a more than 50-year track record of delivering business improvement to some of the world's best-known organizations. Their business advisors are seasoned professionals who have real-world manufacturing experience. They are thought leaders in the fields of supply chain management, integrated business planning, demand management, and product management. Oliver White has offices throughout Europe, North and South America, and the Asia-Pacific region. After the presentation, we're going to move into a Q&A session with questions from you, the audience. So please submit your questions at any time during the presentation using the button at the bottom of your screen. We will not be using people's names or companies. So go ahead and ask whatever you'd like. And if you don't see your question answered during the webinar, please be assured the Oliver White team will reach out to you offline. Okay, let's get to our speakers. Greg Spira is a business advisor with Oliver White and an expert in demand management and integrated business planning. Greg works with companies to implement lasting change at all levels and across functions by building organizational capability and developing high-performing teams. Greg has written and co-authored many white papers on the subject of demand management and is an instructor of the demand management course. We're going to find out more about that later. Stay tuned. Greg has also written a book on demand management for business leaders that will be released later this year. Then we have Charity Lopez, who is an Oliver White business advisor and is also an expert in demand management, brand management, and integrated business planning. She is passionate about working with companies to transform their growth journeys, utilizing her deep knowledge of forecasting, business planning, marketing, and mathematics. Charity helps companies strategize best practice implementations. Right, without further ado, I'm going to hand off to Charity from Oliver White.
Hi, thank you. We actually are going to start off our presentation with a great story from Greg that he has recently just lived through, where this topic really drove home the need for this at an organization.
Great, thanks, Charity. So I think what might be on people's minds is why does all this matter, right? So what's the big deal about managing assumptions and asking questions? How does that help? And I chose this image because it's sort of a metaphor for what a lot of us have been through over the last couple of years, right? So we've been through the pandemic and through disruptions in supply chains. We've had a lot of ups and downs, some excitement, some thrills, some fears, and just when we think we might be making forward progress, we are right back where we started. And so I'd like to share the story of a client, but that we helped, but it wasn't unique to this one client. A lot of organizations I found were in this situation where, they were facing significant increases in demand, to the point where they sort of gave up. They threw their hands up in the air and said, there's no sense in even keeping track of unconstrained demand. We just can't keep up. It was really hard to bring people together in the organization and talk about demand assumptions when everyone's question was, how much supply can we get? How much supply can we get? How much supply can we get? And so they sort of took their eye off the ball. They focused wholly on supply chain. They set their factories to produce as much as possible. But like a roller coaster, what goes up must come down. They really were impacted while they were producing, as much as they could, they were not paying attention to the assumptions that would have to be true for the elevated levels of demand to sustain themselves, particularly over the long run. That and a combination of, because they weren't coming together and discussing and asking the questions and pressure testing those assumptions, different groups in the organization had different mindsets about, well, what would happen, right? So would this be a permanent shift in demand? Would this be the new normal, or would things revert to the way they were before? Or would this be, there was all sorts of different views and perspectives, but they weren't spending the time to bring them together because they didn't think it mattered. Well, it mattered as soon as the demand vanished, effectively. As quickly as it came, it went away. And with the factories producing at full tilt, they effectively backed up their warehouses. They found themselves in actually a bit of a crisis that they didn't even have room in their facilities to produce the products their customers did want. And they hadn't put any time or energy into thinking about what contingency plans might need to be in place in order to move through that inventory that they were now sitting on. And so I share that as a story, and as there may be elements of what I described that resonate with you. There's certainly elements of that we've seen across different industries and different clients. And it's tough. It's really, really tough in this environment when we're dealing with so many supply constraints to say, well, let's keep a close eye on what's going on with demand and what are those assumptions behind the demand. But I share this example because it's so critical. It's not important until it is. And when it sneaks up on you quickly, it's very difficult to catch up. So that's why it's really important as we go through these uncertain times to be having the conversations about what are the assumptions behind our demand plans, what will it take, and what do we need to do in order for this demand to materialize. So with that, I'll hand it back to Charity to speak a little bit more about assumptions and demand planning.
Great. Okay. So taking actually a step back before we talk about assumptions, let's talk about demand. A very important thing to understand is that demand doesn't just happen to us. So if a new product comes up for sale, it doesn't automatically get sales. There's actually some activities that have to occur that are normally driven by specific parts of the organization. So if we think about what is demand, it's customers buying our products or our services. And what's actually causing them to buy them? Well, many times it is through marketing and selling activities. So I mentioned a new product. Somebody needs to sell that into a store so it can be on shelf so a customer can grab it. And if we think about who in the organization actually is responsible for these marketing and sales activities, we immediately go to the marketing and sales organization. And so because these are the activities that are driving the actual sales of our products, we need to make sure that the demand plan reflects these sales and marketing activities and that they're really this result of these efforts. And so these should be the numbers and the thoughts that are driving the demand plan, not the other way around. We want to have the assumptions around the marketing and sales opportunities that they are chasing. This is really the key and fundamental element of building a strong demand plan, is capturing these activities. So if we think about some of these activities and how they come into play, there's lots of examples, and they really fit into 4 large buckets of assumptions across different areas of the business. So if we think about our internal business, we have areas like the strategy, the customer, the market. A lot of these things we have visibility to, some control over, and we can build assumptions around it. So things like advertising and the effectiveness of that, training on pricing. I'm sure many of you on the call are dealing with that right now. That's something that we own, and we know what that activity is going to potentially drive, and we can put assumptions around that. Also, from a customer perspective, knowing if they're going to expand their footprint. There's also assumptions and activities that are a little bit outside of our control, and Greg kind of touched on that in his opening story, but they still need to be discussed and embedded into the demand plan. So an external example that I love to share from my past was hurricanes. So nobody can predict a hurricane, nobody can control a hurricane. But in the business I worked in at the time, in food, we saw a big uptick every week that a hurricane happened during a hurricane season. And so that was an assumption that we all came together, and we didn't know the exact right answer, but we kind of came to alignment on what we wanted to build into the plan. One thing you'll note on these assumptions is many of them are quantifiable, and they're also time-phased. And those are two important elements as you think through what assumptions we want to bring into the demand plan. And they're really, all of these are describing the expectations around these activities. It's getting people on the same page of what is going to actually drive this demand that we're planning for. So some of these are some great examples, but I also want to share is some not so great examples, some more kind of loose assumptions. And these may look familiar to you. I've often sat in meetings where they said, I would like to increase the assumption for the October demand call because we've seen trends increase. Okay, that's pretty vague. And if you look at these different examples here, you see it's very easy and comfortable to explain where the assumption is happening, but not why it's happening. So some things that would not be good examples are assumptions is if you're just using a synonym. So you see this one down in the middle, call down due to lack of momentum. Well, call down and lower momentum, they're kind of the same thing. So you can't explain an assumption with a synonym. Another example here, rolling. So January miss rolled forward into February. It's not necessarily a bad thing to do. However, this is not explaining why you're doing it. It's not telling you what actually happened to cause this shift. And then an example right in the middle, increase driven by product A, B, and C. Again, you're starting to get to it. At least you know that there's a certain product that is driving this change. However, identifying where it is isn't telling us why. These are not bad changes to make, but what they lack is a visibility to the underlying activity that we're expecting to deliver. Because like I said, demand plans are driven by sales and marketing activities. And if we don't have inherent in the demand plan what these activities are, it's going to be very hard to go and execute against them. And so in order to make sure we have the right assumptions, we want to ask some questions to help people get to these really good assumptions that are going to explain the underlying activity. So I'm going to hand it off to Greg now to talk through some approaches, some different approaches we can take to ask these questions to just get these better assumptions.
Thanks, Charity. So, we often, Charity and myself, we often show up at clients where we're not the experts in the room, right? We don't know the business nearly as well as our clients do. But we're thrown into, I've sat in demand reviews from products of all different shapes and sizes and different industries of, from aircraft carriers to gumballs to hair products. There's a wide range of different industries that we support. And we're expected to help contribute. And, the simplest way that I get and understand and sort of test whether or not our assumptions are as robust as they could be, or weed out some of those lower quality assumptions, or even just get the team thinking about the assumptions in a different way, is to ask questions, right? Some people refer to this as the Socratic Method, so therefore it is, by definition, it's not a new thing, right? Socrates lived a long time ago. But the Socratic Method it's a cooperative approach to investigate assertions with questions. And you can use these questions. It's a method of stimulating critical thinking. It's very applicable to demand planning. It's interesting to think that an approach to probe and ask thought-provoking questions to pull out these presuppositions that was done thousands of years ago, still very applicable to demand planning. But it's all about the human behavior aspects of it, right? So when I ask questions in a demand review that I'm not the expert on, there's other people in the room that know it far better than I do. I do it constructively, and I do it from the position of asking why, or asking that question that's missing to better understand, not to challenge the assumption outright, not to, I almost want to lead the person providing option to the realization that it could be better or that it could be more robust, not call it out and put them in the position, right? I'm escalating the issue or escalating the assumption, not the person. So if I see, an assumption like what Charity showed on the previous page, we like to call up next quarter by 10% because of trends. I might ask the question, well, what's driving those trends? Why? How did we come to the conclusion of 10%? Where did that number come from? Why do we think that's going to happen? The answers might be, well, that's what the sales team said, or that's what Bob in marketing told me, or that. But that's good when we put that on the table and we realize that there is less substance behind that assumption. It calls into question, allows us to make better decisions as to what to do with that assumption. It helps us understand the likelihood of it, or what we would need to do as a business. What would have to happen for that demand plan volume or those numbers to come true? So it can be why. Often that many of you will be familiar with the 5 whys exercise, right? Of asking the question why until we get to a root cause. The same thing applies to an assumption, right? Might be, hey, we should increase the demand plan next month, by 100 million units. Well, why is that? Well, because we're running a promotion with a key customer. Okay, well, have you run a promotion with that customer in the past? No, this is the first time doing it. Okay, well, have we run a similar promotion with other customers in the past? Well, yes, we have, and here's the comparators, right? So it starts to really peel back the onion and dig into the robustness of that. And you see, I'm asking the question, not from a position of saying I don't believe it, more from the position of I want to better understand it. And it should avoid having to call out the assumption or call out the individual by saying, hey, that's not a really great assumption. It should allow them to come to the conclusion that, hey, you know what, actually, now that I think about it, now that you're asking these good questions that I don't have good answers to, maybe I need to revisit this, or maybe we need to think about it as maybe not an assumption in our plan, but maybe we flag it as a risk or an opportunity, or maybe we take a follow-up to go and get more information. But it's really important, if you look at these different types of questions, right? What would be an alternative? How do we know this? What would happen if? It's not all about what is the assumption, but it's putting the assumption into context, right? We had a large order from a customer. We need to increase the demand plan. Well, why did they place that order? Was it because, what would happen if they didn't repeat that order in the future? What would happen if, let's say I have a number of clients where competitors are facing supply challenges. And so they're increasing their demand plans because their competitors' plans are coming down. Well, we would ask the question, well, what would we expect when my competitor comes back online? Are they going to recapture all of that demand? Are we going to be able to hold on to some of it because our customers have switched to us and they don't feel like switching back? Similarly, if we've had a supply disruption and we've lost demand to our competitors, do we expect to recapture it? It's all sorts of it's questions, right? It's questions that allow us to better understand, better probe, and ultimately to better business decisions. It's not about, I always say that the goal or the objective of the demand planning process here and asking these questions isn't just to get to an accurate demand plan. The goal here is to make the right business decisions. It's to do the right things commercially, and it's to achieve our business goals and objectives. And so if we position this not from the perspective of, well, I just need to know what the right number is for production, we're cutting ourselves off at the knees. Really, we want to ask these questions from the perspective of, well, what is the right business action? What should we be doing? What are we going to do in order to generate that demand? And then from there, the implications to our demand plan, the numbers, the revenue, the margin, the volume, those flow as an output. Now, from the Socratic Method, if you take this and apply it specifically to demand planning, you might be asking yourself, okay, great, Greg, you've told me some questions to ask. You've said, ask the question why. There's these great questions that Socrates would have asked, 1,000 years ago. There's also questions that we can start to put these into the perspective and give you some examples, something to work with. And these very often, when we talk about demand assumptions, conveniently, they fall into the categories of the 4 Ps. For those of you that remember from either you're in marketing or you remember from your marketing classes in your undergrad, that the 4 Ps are a generic way, and there's some people say there's more Ps, but at least these 4, It's a generic way of describing what causes or what drives people to purchase something, what causes or drives demand. And so across each of these different dimensions, these types of assumptions, there are good questions that we could ask that you could start to put into your repertoire, right? As you become better at this, as you become experienced in asking these questions, you can hone in on places where there's good or bad assumptions. So for example, I spoke earlier about promotions, used the example of, we're running a large customer promotion. Well, I might ask the question, have we done this before? Have we done this with other customers? Are we expecting the incremental lift to be sustained? Are we expecting some change in buying patterns? Are we expecting our customers to revert to previous trends afterwards? Many of you, Charity mentioned at the top of the discussion that many of you are facing pricing challenges. I mean, we're in an inflationary time. And so as we're planning price assumptions into our demand plan, we ask ourselves the questions: will our customers be buying forward or buying in advance of the pricing? And will we do anything to constrain that or control that? Are we following our competitors, or are our competitors following us? And I had one client where they increased their demand, the price of their products, expecting a decrease in volume, and they saw an increase. They were really shocked by it. We turned around and looked at the marketplace and found that their competitors had actually priced more aggressively than them. And so that assumption of what our competitors' response wasn't quite valid, but at least we understood what was going on and why, right? We asked the question, we had written down the assumption. Across distribution, where are we selling our products? We can ask questions of how much inventory might go in to fill a channel or to fill a distributor. We might want to measure whether or not acceptance will be monitored, when will we know when this is going to happen? If I'm securing a tender for a new customer, when will I know when that's triggered, when that happened? And when will normalcy in demand volume begin to take effect? That's thinking about, as I load a new distribution channel, at some point that's going to stabilize and be my new normal, my new level of demand with that increased distribution. And remember, not all distribution is incremental, right? Sometimes I secure demand with one customer and it just takes away demand from another customer. So these are all questions we want to be asking to probe and better understand. Incremental will be, and all of these are questions that, quite frankly, you might say, well, these were addressed or outlined when the business case for the new product was put together, but it doesn't preclude us in the demand planning process from asking those same questions and asking, are those answers still valid? Because when it comes down to it, those of us in the demand planning process, whether you're a demand planner, a marketer, a brand manager, customer account manager, regardless of where you sit, if you're putting together a plan and you're going to be ultimately accountable for that plan in some way, as assumptions are brought to you, as you're being provided with these inputs and assumptions, there's a role of quality control here, right? Asking these good questions has to happen somewhere. And if you just accept the assumption without asking those questions, or at least knowing that those questions were asked, then you're kind of taking on ownership of that assumption or the lack of that assumption. And so I always push to ensure that demand planners or marketers or folks that are in that position of coordinating some sort of a planning process, that they feel empowered to push back when the answers aren't coming, right? If you're asking those questions, asking these good questions, and we're not getting the answers, that's where you need to put your hand up and flag that say, you know what, I don't know that I can put this into the plan, because without an assumption, there's no way to legitimize or to validate or to explain what we need to do in order for that volume to materialize. Now, I know that can be controversial. Some of you might feel pressured by people higher up than you in the organization to load volumes into the demand plans, or certain assumptions are given that you don't necessarily feel comfortable with. But it's not about saying no. It's just about saying, I'd be happy to add that volume to the demand plan or take that volume out of the demand plan. I just need to have the assumption to go along with it, right? It's really just enforcing discipline. It's not passing judgment on somebody else's view or expectation, because quite frankly, very often demand planners we're not the closest to the customers or closest to the market, although we very often have a lot of experience in that space. But our job is just to help make sure that when things are being put into the plan and when it's being consolidated, that we're ensuring that the right level of due diligence is being put into those inputs. It really does help, not only driving the questions, but also remember my story at the beginning, when I had the example of the roller coaster on the page. At that client, they were in a pickle. Right? They had implicitly made certain assumptions. They didn't know what they were, but there was an implicit assumption that demand would continue to be, well above their production capacity indefinitely. When they didn't think about what would have needed to be true for that to stay high, it also precluded them from thinking about what contingencies or mitigation plans they might need if things were to go the other way. And so asking these questions helps us to think about not only what do we think is going to happen in the future, but what might happen in the future that we might need to create scenarios or contingency plans for. Now, what you would not have anticipated when I was showing you that picture of the roller coaster was that there was a little bit of a trivia associated with it. So for those of you that saw the picture of the roller coaster and immediately said, wow, I know exactly which roller coaster that is and where it is. And there may be none of you, there may be 3 of you, there may be 100 of you, I don't know. But if you know which roller coaster that was and or where it is, once this webinar wraps up, just send an email. There'll be a link or an email address in the follow-up information that you get. And I think at the beginning of the talk, it was mentioned that I've been working on a new demand management book. And so there are those of you that are lucky enough to have known where that roller coaster is and send us an email, we'll make sure you get a copy of the book. But with that, the last thing I'm going to wrap up on is just when we have all of these assumptions and we've challenged them and we've asked good questions, we want to have a way to reflect them and to share them and present them back. So you go through all this exercise of asking the good questions. You go through the Socratic approach. Don't leave it there, right? You may have your notes. You've asked the due diligence questions. You feel good about the assumptions in the plan. The last thing I'll leave on is make sure that the answers to those questions, the assumptions that you've gathered, the answers to the expectations of activities in the future are documented and visible in your demand review process. And there are many different ways to do that. I've illustrated here on the page a couple of different ways that we commonly suggest companies approach it. You may be familiar with building blocks, where we're reflecting, a plan and what constituent pieces of the puzzle need to happen in terms of, in this example, it's dealer inventory and admission rates. It's more from a healthcare perspective. We could do bridging, where we're explaining what are the changes in the plan in words. Or what we have on the top right, we like to call it a 6-box. We've got one client that likes to call it a 6-pack, but I like the term 6-pack. But it's a way to write down in words, right? The answers to those questions, just to reiterate this, asking those questions, the answer isn't numbers. The answers to those questions are words. And so making sure that those words are reflected in the demand review so people can see them and they can make sure that they agree with them, right? That all of the people who are consenting and approving this demand plan and then committing to follow it and abide by it, understand what those key assumptions are within the plan. So with that, we have time. We have about quite a few minutes here to answer questions. So I'd like to turn it back over to Helen to help us address questions that you guys might have.
Hi. Yeah. Well, first of all, I've got a couple of preloaded questions that I'm curious about, and we're also getting some great questions in from the audience. And I know at least one person is very curious to know what that roller coaster is. So we'll see who wins the prize. So I guess it's a little bit of an obvious question, but is there such a thing as too many questions? Charity, what's your opinion about that?
So it's an interesting question. I really don't think there is, as long as you're doing it for the right reason. So we want clarity to the point that we can actually influence a decision or make a decision. So knowing what we want to produce, when and where and how much. However, if you're just asking questions to stall and you already know the decision you're wanting to make, that may be a case where that may be too many questions. I think of an example a client gave us of a woman walks into a shoe shop. She knows what she wants to buy. She tears apart the shop anyway, and then ends up only taking that one pair home. It can be similar in a demand review. You know the assumption you want to make, but you're going to go make the teams go do a bunch of work. That may be an instance where let's all work around and get around that one assumption. Otherwise, as long as you're asking these good questions and just peeling back the onion, I don't think there can be too many questions.
Right, that's great. Yeah, so no asking questions just for the sake of it. But generally, as they say, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Greg, here's another more general question. What if there aren't good answers to the questions that we're asking? What do we do then?
Well, I think the fun part of this is there's actually no answers to any of the questions because there's no facts in the future, right? There's no like factual answers to any question about an assumption in the future. It's just an assumption. Now, as I said earlier, if the people being asked the question can't come up with a good answer, it might have them realize that it wasn't a really good assumption. So in some cases, it might have us take pause and say, you know what, maybe we shouldn't make this adjustment. But there are other cases where we know we need to take, we don't have an answer, but maybe the answer doesn't exist, right? Like that we haven't really thought through it. That doesn't mean we don't need to take a position, right? We still, in the future, if we're going to plan, and I say to Charity's example earlier about hurricanes, I might not know how many hurricanes there's going to be next year, but I can't just say, well, I guess I just don't know, and then just say it's not planned. We can't plan for it. But you have to pick something, right? Yeah. Say 5, and then at least you know if there's 6, then that's why you were low. If there was 4, you know that's why you were high, right? So it's our job to know what we know and know what we don't know, and make the best assumptions we can about the things that we need to.
Right. Wonderful. Another point, who should be answering these questions? Who? Sales, marketing, finance, everybody?
Yeah, that's a good one. So the owner of the demand plan, who oftentimes is the commercial owner of the business, they're really accountable to make sure all of these assumptions are well defined. But they may not be, or the demand planner may not be the expert in that area to give the best answer. And so I'd say that these assumptions kind of live with different owners across the organization, just depending on how your organization is set up. We talked already several times about pricing because it is a big assumption right now. In some companies, they actually have revenue growth management teams. That's their whole world, is they're looking at pricing and how it's going to impact and play out in the market. I would say in that case, they're going to be responsible and own the answer kind of to that question. You think about your promotional plans, that may sit with sales. Your advertising, marketing is going to have the best view. So you want to make sure you are involving those right people who feel the ownership and have the best viewpoint to those assumptions.
Wonderful. That's great. Thank you, Charity. That's a very sensible answer. And what is the best level of detail to make assumptions at? You know, are we talking SKUs, product category, business unit? Greg, what's your feeling about that? How deep do you go?
It's a really good question, and it's something that a lot of people trip themselves up with, because I find a lot of, I would say, less mature demand planning processes operate at a very low level of detail, right? The mindset is, I need to plan at a SKU level because I got to manufacture it at a SKU level. So therefore I need to know the assumptions at a SKU level, but it's not the right answer, actually. The assumption, the level of detail of the assumption is inherent to the assumption. So if you think about what drives demand, remember those 4 Ps, right? Those 4 Ps that drive demand. Promotion. My promotional activities, if I have a brand or a product family that I promote together, the assumption is at that brand level, right? It's not at a SKU. Like I'm doing a promotion for this brand. And so what we don't want to do is force ourselves to have to break assumptions up into little itty bitty pieces and lose the relevance of them. Whereas I have, an assumption for a new product, right? That 4th P, well, that's by its very nature at a SKU level and at a new item level. So you really we want to preserve the integrity of those words and those assumptions at the level of detail that they exist. Then the trick is to match our demand planning hierarchy to be able to accept those assumptions at those levels. And that's where companies get into a little bit of trouble if they don't have really good or flexible demand planning hierarchies. But it is absolutely the best way to provide the integrity of those assumptions and link them with the plans.
Right, excellent. And what I'm hearing from both of you is, I think, going back to this Socratic method, and that Socrates really wanted to take everything back to first principles, and by asking questions, and precisely in order to uncover the assumptions that were being made at every level. And I think that's a really good reminder. I'm sorry, I don't want to hammer the message too hard, but I don't think it can be hammered too hard. I mean, it really is. We are walking around, all of us, making assumptions all day long and not necessarily digging underneath them to find out whether they're still appropriate and useful. That's fantastic. And now we're going to move into our Q&A session with questions from the audience, which I'm very excited about. And I've got a first one here. And forgive me. How do you weight the importance of capturing sales team assumptions? When should that be entering the forecast in terms of a young startup's forecast maturity?
Well, I'll take a stab at this. So I'm going to key on the term young startup,
right?
Because it really depends on who is closest to those assumptions and how impactful those assumptions are on driving demand in your business. So let's say I'm a young startup. Very often, and I'm generalizing here, I don't know the specific company, but very often startups are growing through distribution. They're growing by expanding the distribution of their product. And what I mean is that they're getting into new channels or getting new customers or new geographic regions, and they're growing that way. As opposed to, there's very often, particularly in consumer goods companies, but I'm sure this applies more broadly, there becomes an inflection point where once you're sort of available, once your one product or a couple of products are available more or less everywhere that you have sales coverage, and then you're going to start to grow by innovating and creating different product lines and expanding the portfolio of products that you have. Now, I'm being generic here. Your business strategy is what's going to dictate that. But let's say that's if that was the case, then I would say, well, who's accountable for securing distribution growth? And that's an example where I might find the sales organization is primarily accountable for that. And in that case, if I'm a startup and I'm growing through distribution and securing new contracts, and the sales team is largely accountable for that, well, then I'm going to place a huge amount of emphasis and ownership of sales inputs and assumptions into the demand planning process versus, a very mature demand planning process in a company that's, a consumer good like a P&G or a Mondelez or a Kraft Heinz, mac and cheese. You can find it everywhere, right? I challenge you to go and find a place where you can't buy. Isn't it like Coca-Cola has got the broadest distribution on the earth, right? You can go anywhere on earth and find a Coke, right? They're not growing through distribution. And so they're going to grow through product innovation and new flavors and different things like that. So those inputs would tend to come from, marketing or product development organization. So we usually link this back to what's going on in your business. And who's contributing, who's closest to and contributing the most impactful assumptions for your demand plan.
Wow. Okay, that's a fantastic answer. Thank you so much, Greg. I just want to remind everybody, please do feel free to ask your questions using the button at the bottom of your screen, and we won't be using people's names or titles or companies, so you can feel free to ask whatever you want. And if you don't see your question answered online, you will get it answered offline by Oliver White. I've got a great question here for you, Greg. Again, how have you seen organizations work through situations where different functions and business units don't agree on assumptions? And this person says, from my experience, assumptions can be somewhat of a politically motivated topic for some business units.
Well, this is it's a good
We're
question.
laughing because we know it.
This is why we ask these questions, right? This is why I said earlier ask to understand, not to challenge. The Socratic approach is about being apolitical in it. Just like, let me just understand this a little bit better, right? Just help me understand what would need to be true for this to happen, right? And let people state and explore their position. Now, it's also why consensus is a very tricky thing, right? We would say that to come to consensus on the demand plan isn't to agree to the number. It's to agree to the list of assumptions, because we want to agree, what are we going to go and do, right? So that when we leave the room, the list of assumptions is really the to-do list for the sales and marketing organization or product management organization. So if we can't come to, so one way to look at it is to say, if there's an assumption, does that assumption mean somebody would have to go and do something? And if yes, well, then ask the person who would have to go and do it, whether they're going to go do it. Like, so if there's an assumption of secure an additional customer contract, I'd go to the sales team and say, are you confident you're going to go and get that contract with the customer? And if they say yes, well, then others could debate, but they're the ones that are signing up for it and having to go and do it. Now, if it's one of the assumptions like, hey, we're assuming COVID is going to continue for the next 20 years, none of us are in control of that. That's where, as Charity said earlier, there's a demand plan owner, somebody who's has an accountability for those assumptions being reasonable and unbiased. And sometimes it will come down to that person making a decision. Now, that doesn't mean that visibility to the dispute goes away. We retain the visibility of those different alternate options through risks, opportunities, and scenarios. So if there's a contention, say, I think they're going to go left, and the other I think they're going to go right. Well, somebody's got to pick. We're all going left, but then we can do a scenario around, well, but if we should have all gone right, here's what the implications are. Mm-hmm. But there's a decision making, like somebody's got to make the final call on the assumptions. But I'm really careful to say, don't just pick a number, pick the set of assumptions.
Right.
And then keep visibility to the other options and alternatives.
And that's really interesting, because it sounds like quite often the temptation in a situation like that might be to kind of split the difference. But in a way, that's what you're saying. Don't just pick a number, or don't, that a compromise might actually be the worst scenario. Is that true? Am I picking you up correctly?
100%.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
You don't want to pick a random number that sits in the middle, because you don't know who's going to deliver the activities that drive that random number, versus all agreeing to the activities and then seeing what the result is. Much more.
That's really interesting. Excellent. That sounds like a very important point. And Charity, I've got a question to follow on from the last one, which is the opposite, which is, what can I do where sales or marketing or another division just simply won't provide any assumptions or answers to your question? So you haven't got conflicting opinions and assumptions, you've got none. Yeah. What do you do in that situation?
Yeah. So oftentimes we hear this from demand planners. They're like, we're trying to pull and we're not getting anything. You guys, the demand planning team, has an understanding of the business. So sometimes it can help to offer them something to react to. So rather than saying, I need this assumption from scratch, go make it and bring it back to me. If you say, okay, this is what I know about the business, this is not what I know about the actuals, this is how I would kind of approach this assumption. And then saying, hey, this is what I put together. Can you look at this and give me your thoughts? Oftentimes it's a little bit more approachable and you'll get the feedback that way, versus asking for a blanket assumption. So I think that's one of the best ways to approach it.
Right. Well, as a writer, I know how terrifying a blank piece of paper can be. So you give them stuff to disagree with, even.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Tell me why this is wrong or what I should change on this.
Right. Super. Thank you. So I have another audience question here. How can we build these assumptions into the demand planning system? I think they want a little bit more nitty gritty on how you actually go from assumption to demand plan.
Yeah, I can take that one. The short answer is it depends on your system. So that's the classic consulting answer. It depends. I'll say in my experience, most common demand planning tools don't do a great job of documenting assumptions. They're really good at numbers. That's what they're there for, right? They do aggregation, disaggregation, statistical forecasts. They do a very terrible job of what the words are and what those assumptions are. Some newer systems can support the documentation of assumptions, but I usually recommend that you support your demand planning tool with some sort of a side, like an assumptions journal. That's how I usually describe it. And some of the examples that I showed of the building blocks and those bridge charts, that's sometimes generated through an assumptions journal. And what that really comes down to is a standardized place for planners and marketers and salespeople to write down the words that are associated with the demand plan volumes. I'm probably not going to get into a technical discussion here, but it's usually a side tool or supporting tool that can help you get there.
Right, fantastic, thank you. Here's another question, I think for both of you actually. What if I know there is a strong chance one of the assumptions they're making isn't valid, but the team agrees not to change the plan? Is there anything I can do to sort of deliver a wake-up call?
Yeah, so this kind of goes back a little bit to Greg's answer to the political question.
Yes,
I've been in the place, I've been in the room when I've been told, this is the assumption, you will put it into your plan. It's, by the owner, and there's not much discussion. In that case, I think it's a really strong tool to have the risks and ops tracker, to say, okay, it's fine, but I'm going to put a risk front and center on the page that this is what we believe may come out of the plan. And then moving forward, it's revisiting that. So another great way to really bring back, power to the objectivity of the discussion is to bring in the actuals. So once you actually start moving, because oftentimes assumptions are over a course of many periods, not just a single month. Right. And so as you actually go through those periods and you see things actualized, bringing in that information and the actual performance of the business back into the discussion to say, hey, this is what happened. Is this what we were expecting? Or should we revisit this crazy assumption that you maybe put into the plan?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And actually, Greg, just to follow up to that, maybe you could tell us, how important is it to validate that the assumptions actually turned out to be correct? Is that so? Is that like an important metric?
Well, I usually tell my clients and tell everybody that if you can't come to an agreement on why the past is what it is, then it's gonna be really difficult for you to come to an agreement on what the future might be, right? So consensus on what's actually happened is the starting point, right? It's why often, people start to explain why are we missing last month? In explaining that in context, if you don't have assumptions well documented, you'll start from a blank sheet of paper every time you actualize a month. You'll say, we were high or low on the demand plan. And Charity said this earlier, you'll start looking into where did you miss? You'll be able to easily answer, where did I miss? I missed in this customer or in this region or on this product. But you'll then start constructing hypotheses as to why you missed. Instead of, and the better option is, when you have assumptions about what's going to drive performance, then you have a list of, did these things come true, yes or no? Instead of starting from a blank sheet and saying, well, I wonder why I missed the number last month. Now, it's true, you won't always be able to get that answer every month for last month's actuals or every week for last week's actuals. It might take you 3 or 4 months or even a year to know truly. But again, you have to test the assumption and just ask yourselves, do we still, with this amount of information, which will be imperfect at best, do we still believe that these assumptions are reliable as it stands? And over time, right, you might say, you know what, we have a positive bias. We continue to plan higher than what we actually deliver, and irrespective of supply issues. Is that because which of these assumptions that we've been relying on isn't good, right? Which of these things is not materializing? And that's a good exercise, right? To go and ask the improving questions and gather supporting data. Because, in the end, if you don't have if those assumptions are not right, you will make the wrong business decisions. Second place. The second thing you need to do is get the right demand plan. The first thing you need to do is make the right business decisions. Am I promoting the right products? Am I doing the right advertising activities? Am I selling to the right customers? Am I growing the business the right way? And when you have bad assumptions, you will just fundamentally make bad business decisions.
Yeah, sure. And that brings me to there's like a couple of questions here about summarizing and reporting and sort of assessing the assumptions? I mean, do you end up with a sort of Excel spreadsheet that shows, you know, well, we made this assumption and this is how it worked out and this is how we might proceed in the future? Or what does a report look like? An assumption check report look like?
Yeah, so it can be in different versions. You know, it could be as simple as writing down on, like, in words what we thought would happen, and then going back to those words and saying, did that happen? Greg shared the example slide of a few kind of tools that we've worked with we've seen work well with clients. Excel documents, kind of tracking, here's the period of the change, here's the impact of the change across different quarters, and then kind of a living, breathing document, bucketing that into groups of assumptions so you can easily tell the story, because that's the other part of it, right? So what Greg was saying, it's important to understand how you're running your business. You also want to be able to explain and tell the story of what that demand plan is, so that you can easily get consensus and having that visibility. So oftentimes, again, like the tools out of the box, really great at statistical forecasting, maybe less great at putting words in it. So having an offline tool like Excel or some other supporting tools is usually the best way to get these report outs.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just widening the picture out a little bit, I've got a number of questions here about all the supply chain disruptions. Yes, here we are, inevitably. And so I think people are very interested to know how changes in consumer and B2B customer behavior has obviously changed, often quite unpredictably in the last few years. And also there have been supply chain issues. Can you talk a little bit about how those sort of wildly unpredictable elements play into demand planning, and how, you know, really digging into the assumptions can help that? I know this is sort of in many ways what the whole subject is about, but I think particularly in the context of quite dramatic fluctuations and changes.
I think it could be a good place for Greg, you to go back to your story and to say, you know, what do you suggest that that team would have done with these wild fluctuations?
So it's a yes, but, right? So it's impossible to go. So there's a principle of you need to understand, or at least have an assumption for. Again, there's no facts in the future, and some of these things are difficult to know concretely, but you need to have an assumption for what your unconstrained demand potential is, even if you're not able to supply and to support it, right? Because even if it's significantly above your supply capacity, my original story, the situation was it was above supply until it wasn't, right? Until it dipped. And without having an eye on that ball, you don't know when that's going to turn or what's going to change. It's also important to know just how much, and have an aligned view of how much we're leaving on the table, because, you know, different people might have different views, and unless we reconcile them, we won't come to an agreed view as to what we're going to do on the supply chain side of things in order to recover. Most, I'm not saying all, but most businesses are demand driven, and that we want to respond and chase and support the demand that exists in the marketplace. Fewer are more like intentionally constrained, like a fashion company that creates, I'm going to make 100 of these fashionable handbags, and that's all I'm going to make, and then they go to the highest bidder. Like there's probably not many of you on this call, or on this webinar. So, but you know, if you're demand driven, understanding what your unconstrained demand is first step one. But I will say you do need to understand the implications of supply constraints on the forward-looking demand picture. I wouldn't be here saying just ignore it, because it does have an impact. It has an impact in two ways. One, in that I need to steer around, right? We said we're not here just to get an accurate demand plan. We're here to meet our business objectives. And so I need to know where those supply gaps and constraints are in order to try to navigate around them and sell the things that I can make and not the things that I can't. But it's also important in industry. So I have a healthcare customer where, you know, if you're in a hospital and you have a patient on the operating room table, and I don't have this length tube for a catheter, but I have a longer one, I'm going to use a longer one. The patient's
Yeah.
on the opposite tail. Like, I have an obligation to substitute products, right? And there's lots of product substitutability, there's a word, out there in the market. And so when you know you're constrained on one product, you do need to have an assumption as to what is that going to mean to impact to other products, right? You may have increase in demand in another format or size as a result of that sort of constraint that you're dealing with. So
Wow.
it is important.
Wow, that's fantastic. We're actually running a little tight on time now, so we've got time for one more question, and this is for both Greg and Charity. How would you suggest I start? How have you helped other organizations with assumptions? Where do we start, Greg?
I think the first step is just to set the expectation that we need to write our assumptions down and then work from there, getting something on the page to start iterating and improving the quality over time. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, and then the work that we've experienced with our clients, it's usually a combination of tools, training, side-by-side coaching, helping to get this capability, because you really have to get it across the organization to really operate this way. So I definitely recommend, if you're starting on this journey, to find a strong partner to work with you along the way and be able to collaborate with them.
Fantastic. Good. Charity, thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much to Charity and Greg from Oliver White, and then a special thanks to all of you for participating. I think we've learned a lot about questions and assumptions in demand planning, and maybe you'll all go and look up Socrates after this too. I recommend it. We had a lot of questions today, and we'll be answering the ones we didn't get to with you offline. You're also going to get an email later with a link to view the webinar on demand, and you can share that with your friends if they're interested. And there'll be some information like you see right now on about the courses offered by Oliver White, both in person and online, including an assumptions workshop over there on the, I think on the right-hand side. And you can hear more from Greg in the demand management course. It sounds like that'll be fun. There will also be contact information for Oliver White in the email, but you can see it here too. So you can reach out to them if you have more questions. Thanks a lot to everybody for participating. Stay safe, stay happy, and have a great day. Bye.
Thanks.